Hi, everybody. Um, Welcome to this little mini lecture. I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about how to construct your exegesis. So, just what is an exegesis? An exegesis is a reflective essay. They're both those terms are used, and so it will depend on, I guess, the conventions of the unit coordinator or your teacher, which term is used, but they both mean the same thing. So it's a very common academic convention in anything that has a practice based component to it. Um, so, at the media school, we use reflective essays or exegeses with all types of practice media work. This could be journalism, it could be filmmaking, it could be podcasting, it could be constructing websites or whatever. Anything that you do where you produce some form of media, uh, the exegesis is the academic reflection of the production of this. This is what sets universities apart from other forms of training organisations. Universities, traditionally are places where theories and concepts are engaged with, but over the last few decades they've become a lot more practice based, but they still have that very strong theoretical element to the teaching and learning process, and it's in the exegesis where that is significant. And of course, it's not just media. In law, medicine, nursing, education, fine arts, music, and a range of other disciplines all use this this academic device. So, an exegesis allows you to discuss the process of creating your work and contextualize your work within the wider disciplinary and industry conventions. You can discuss the decisions you made, what went wrong, what went right, and in discussing that, you'll find academic work that supports and helps you critique and helps you examine those points that you've raised. So it is very much an academic essay and should be approached as such. So you should write it in a scholarly style with academic references. Okay, so it's not in a colloquial style. It's not in a. You can write it in a first person if you want to, but just because you're writing in a first person does not mean that you're not writing in a formal way. It doesn't mean that you can use overly colloquial language if it's not appropriate, or this is just a diary entry where you reflect on your own thoughts and feelings. It is an academic work and needs to be treated as such. In some cases, your work will only be obliquely referred to. So, the body of your exegesis may be more about the theory underpinning what you're doing. So, for example, you may choose to, fully examine the process of interviewing within your exegesis, and you can mention, especially if your major assignment went well and the interview went well and you wanted to reflect on that, you could really examine the process of the interview. Why do we use interviews? What was gained from your interview, which may be a face-to-face interview where the interviewee provided much more information than you thought, was much more forthcoming. So you can start examining why it is that the interview space elicits, especially the personal interview space elicits such a desire for confession and for discussion and for self-analysis, of which they do. And there's lots of literature about this. Okay, you just need to go to the UTAS library and search this up and find articles about this, and you'll find a lot of literature about that sort of thing. And if it was doing that sort of essay, you could just your own work might only be one paragraph in that essay, and the rest of it may be this very kind of in-depth rumination on the process of the interview. But in other times, your own work will be central to the discussion. So referencing and sources, of course, you need references in your exegesis. We do, and sometimes in the rubrics, we do mention a minimum number, but I'm not overly keen on this. You'll know how many references you need, and you will, your work will reflect what references are required and how many are required. You've been supplied some of these through the semester, and there are links in a number of the Milo content pages, but also you can feel free to do your own research into this. Um, as a fairly standard rule of thumb, get most things from peer-reviewed academic journals, and depending on what the subject matter is, and especially in our discipline in media studies, currency is quite key. So you want references. If you're talking about contemporary media practice, you don't want references that are any older than say 2014 or so. Sometimes, say if you're looking at framing or one of these core theories, you can stretch back and get older ones. But say if you're talking about things like social media or digital media or those sort of contemporary phenomena that is the technology and the practice and the culture is moving very quickly, you don't want to be too old in the references that you use. So always read the articles and see what their currency is, and see what their relevance is to your subject. The range of things that you might be talking about could be journalism practice as a whole, could be interviewing, could be more specific things like on and off the record aspects of interviewing. You could be about the production of scripts and things like where dialogue is situated within a script, or where backstory or something like that is situated within the script. So these are all the different types of subject matter that could form your exegesis. And everything, of course, needs to be cited in the Harvard style. I just mentioned this before, but I do get that question about how many references, and I did say how many you need. And I'm always a little bit wary when students ask me, what is the minimum number of references? Because as a teacher, I hear that and I think, the student is kind of looking for the minimum effort that they need to do to kind of pass, which is always a little bit of a red flag, just semantically and psychologically. I don't think it's just as a rule of thumb that try to avoid that question, to pose that question to your teachers, because they probably be like me and not really like it. So as a general rule of thumb, there's a kind of an idea of one reference for every 200 words, which is about a length of a paragraph. But it's also, you can say, well, do I need a reference? Am I introducing a concept or an idea or something within the body of the work that needs evidence? It's not just coming from me as a speaker. It's actually a body of evidence that supports what I am saying. Sometimes, for example, if you're writing a little bit of a literature review, a little bit of what has been happening in this context for the last little while, you might have a lot of different references, but other times you might use the one reference a number of times. This is not a very long essay, it's 1,000 words, so maybe 5 or 6 or 7 references, I don't know. But again, don't go for the bare minimum and don't stretch it out. Just use what you need to use, but you need to get into the academic habit of making a statement if you can, and then backing it up with evidence. And it's through this that your own originality will come through. Even very experienced scholars always use references. They're not just talking off the top of their heads. They're working within a canon of literature and a canon of scholarship that they're basing their work on. So this is not trying to somehow impinge on your own creativity or your own academic brilliance. It's just situating your work within a disciplinary field. And also remember that all articles and books and films and all other media needs to be cited. There is a Harvard referencing guide on Milo and on the library website as well. They're really easy to find, and they have a really comprehensive, and will give you guidelines on how to reference everything. Whether it be a podcast or a movie or a journal article, those tricky things like an edited, a multi-authored entry in an edited book, and all these slightly complex referencing forms, the referencing guide will be very specific about how you can do that. There are also referencing generators that you can find where you put your information in and it will generate the reference for you. I mean, they're fine. I don't personally use them because I kind of think that it's more just as much work to put it into the referencing machine, to the generator, and then generate the reference than it is to just learn how to do the reference and then do it. And also they can be a little bit wrong. They're actually quite a pedantic form referencing, and you have to be exact on style, down to the commas and down to the colons and things like this. So yeah, I would just learn to do them yourself. I think it's a little bit better to do that. So here's an example. So this is an example from an exegesis, and it says, although I tried to prepare in advance, it should be advanced and not advanced. There's a bit of a mistake. I was unprepared for an interviewee who wanted to remain anonymous. My main concern was how to maintain the credibility of my story without betraying the confidentiality I promised to my subject. The core of my journalism was a story about the burden of societal expectations on professionals who work in social care, and to discuss how service is not an exact science. When I found getting someone to talk on record was difficult, I decided to offer anonymity to my social worker as she could speak more openly. Okay, so there in that first passage, that's a reflection on or a discussion on what they were doing, and what their feature was about. So that satisfied that part of the brief. And then it says, this follows Radin's 2007, whose work on the anonymity effect found that, despite the plethora of warnings, anonymous sources are perceived to be as credible and influential as identified sources. So there's a nice quote and a reference. My source chose a different name, and as a result was akin to conversation about how difficult her work can be. Okay, so that's a good example of situating their work within or a problem within their practice that they encountered during their work, and then some academic analysis of the problem and the question, and how issues around this are taken up by the discipline of journalism studies, and then the solution, and how it panned out in the final piece of work. So that's quite a nice little paragraph there. Here's an introduction to an exegesis, and one that is about the student obviously wrote a script. Dialogue is one of the most difficult aspects of script writing, because good filmmaking understands that effective dialogue is as much in the acting as the words. And then there's a quote from Truffaut's famous book on acting. In this exegesis, I will discuss how I wrote my dialogue to reflect the personalities and background of my characters through the words I had them speak, but also the gestures I inserted in the text. So there, of course, you provide a classic thesis statement to your essay, what you're going to say in your essay, but you've also got the reference there from Truffaut, which situates this within the broader scope of film studies and film analysis. So Alfred Hitchcock was a master of gesture, as Truffaut describes. He was able to create mood without recourse to dialogue. But before focusing on gesture, I wanted this is a bit of a mistake in there. I wanted speech to convey the building of tension of the scene. I gave my character Mick a slight stutter as a way to convey when he was confident and when he was stressed. For his partner in crime, Jono, I varied the intensity of expletives for the same effect. So there are two references there. You see that Truffaut is in 1985 and 1983, and you'll also see that there is a bit of reported speech there from Hitchcock that's reported in Foucault's 1983 work, and that therefore demands a page reference, whereas the top one is more just a general concept of what Truffaut was talking about, and therefore it only demands a year reference. It doesn't demand a page reference. So again, these things are something that you need to learn to do in all your essays throughout your university career, and and it's really good practice and really good convention, and it's good to be able to be an active reader in this sort of thing as well. Right, so just an overview of what we've been talking about and what you need in exegesis. Of course, you need a clear writing style, and you need that for all your work. So it's to contextualize and examine your challenge, okay, what you did in your practice-based work, and then an explanation of your approach and the solutions to any problems that you encountered. And then you back those up with academic references. So they're not difficult things to conceptualize, and there are different approaches you can take depending on what your practice was like. Again, I'm going to reiterate that if your practice went quite well, but you wanted to really focus on the issue of, say, interviewing, or the process of writing or something like this, that can be what you concentrate your exegesis on. Otherwise, you can be a little bit more general and a little bit more kind of generally autobiographical about the process of media production, and then you can focus on that as well. So there are various approaches you can use, but it shouldn't be too much of a challenge, and it's also something that you need to get used to, because these essays will accompany all your practice-based assignments at the media school. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.